namely that while I could not reveal the source who gave us the copy of your letter, that it was my impression this morning that our source had gotten it from someone at the Pentagon. I must also tell you that I got a call from that source after your press conference this morning in New Hampshire, in which that person told me that indeed it had not come from the Pentagon. He put us on to a couple of other clues that we followed up during the course of the day. And just to bring our audience fully up to date, you know I called you late this afternoon to bring you up to speed on that. Given that information and the fact that World News Tonight got its information from Colonel Jones, who was an aide to the head of the ROTC at the University of Arkansas, do you still feel that the Bush administration bears any burden of responsibility for the release of this letter?
I have no idea. I don't know what your source was or where it came from, so I can't comment on that. I think the important thing is that the letter is consistent with everything I've been saying for the last 13 years since I was first asked about this in late 1978. I was in the draft before the lottery came in. I gave up the deferment. I got a high lottery number and I wasn't called. That's what the records reflect. A Republican member of my draft board has given an affidavit in the last couple of days saying that I got no special treatment, and nothing in that letter changes that, although it is a true reflection of the deep and conflicted feelings of a just turned 23-year-old young man. I felt that at the time. And indeed, if we were electing that 23-year-old man, what he said and thought and felt at that time would be germane. What is germane now, however, is what the 45 or 46-year-old Bill Clinton thinks. And when you wrote, for example, that at the time you felt perhaps that young men ought to have a chance to selectively decide whether they wanted to be conscientious objectors in a particular war. The way things are right now, I should explain to our audience, is you're either a conscientious objector across the board. You can't pick and choose. You can't say, I like this war, don't like that war. Where does Bill Clinton stand on that issue today? I have somewhat different feelings about that now. I think we ought to have a draft only when there is clear and present need, when we're going to have a lot of people in harm's way, when the volunteer army is insufficient to the task, and when there ought to be broad-based service. I do think when you have a general draft, at least there ought to be a declaration of war so that Congress can say the broad national interests are at issue. Or at least something like Senator Nunn's War Powers Act ought to be enacted. The problem we had in Vietnam was that we were ambivalent. We actually wound up weakening our military and undermining our military posture in the world for years after that, because the country didn't support it, the people were divided, and the truth was we never really intended to, nor were we able to win the war in any conventional sense. We had last year, obviously, a volunteer army in Operation Desert Storm. You were one of the few leading Democrats in the country who supported that operation. Let's say Bill Clinton had been president at the time, and let us just say hypothetically that there had been a draft in place, and that several thousands or tens of thousands of young men had taken the view that young Bill Clinton took back in 1969. What would President Clinton have done about that? Well, I would have asked the Congress for an explicit expression of support through the United Nations. And I think that I would have asked, if we'd had the draft, I would have asked them to actually declare war. I think once the Congress declares war under the Constitution, then you can have a broad conscription. I think, as I said, I think it was warranted in World War II. I think, as I said, I supported the conflict in Korea. Our country has shown over and over again that large numbers of our people will voluntarily serve in the armed forces when there is broad-based support for a policy, when they understand it. But Governor, that was clearly the case in Desert Storm. Before we have to take a break, and we will in a little bit less than a minute, my question was what President Clinton would have done or would have recommended to his Justice Department be done with, let's say, a few thousand young men who took the position that you took 20-some-odd years ago, namely, we don't like this war. We don't think blood should be shed for oil. Even if there had been a declaration of war, what do you do with young men like that who are acting on their conscience? Well, first of all, in a democracy, I favor the kind of volunteer force that we have now. If we had had a draft, then I would have gone to the Congress and asked for an explicit declaration of war. Then I would not have approved a selective conscientious objection. The problem with Vietnam all along was the ambivalence that ripped through our country, that ripped through our policy, and the fact that it was simply wrong-headed. It weakened the military, it weakened our position in the world. But in order to have, I have different views now than I did then. about the appropriateness of that selective conscientious objector doctrine. But at least I think if you're going to have a draft and not allow conscientious objection on a particular basis, the United States Congress, which has the constitutional authority to declare war, ought to have to do it.
Governor Clinton, we're going to have to take a break. When we come back, and again, I should tell our audience, this is something I discussed with the governor this morning. We'll do a few more minutes on this subject and then also talk about other issues. We'll continue our discussion in a moment.